I'm Nala Ayed. Welcome to Ideas and to the third of the 2020 CBC Massey Lectures, Reset, Reclaiming the Internet for Civil Society, by world-renowned internet communications and security expert Ron Deibert. We've got a problem. The internet, the great tool that was supposed to put information at everyone's fingertips and make the world a whole lot better, has been taken over by forces that seem beyond our control. In his 2020 CBC Massey Lectures, Ron Deibert explores what went wrong and what we might do about it. Ron Deibert is director of Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto, a research group that focuses on digital threats to human rights and civil society. They've investigated cyber attacks against Mexican journalists, disinformation spread by Iran, and the hacking of the Democratic Party emails in 2016. In his 2020 CBC Massey Lectures, Ron Deibert ranges over many of the issues that plague the internet and social media. The latest insights into the psychology of marketing and the hacking of human behavior are being used to turn us into addicts. Our personal data is being vacuumed up, turning us all into products for sale. Governments in general and malign players in particular are using social media tools against us as a weapon. And the question is, what is to be done? There's no Massey Lectures tour this year, but we've assembled a panel to comment on what Ron Deibert is talking about. Some of the people you'll hear from time to time through the programs are writer and filmmaker Astra Taylor, human rights lawyer Chinmayi Arun, philosophy professor Tamsin Shah, journalist and author Misha Glenny, former Google executive Meredith Whittaker, journalist and author John Naughton, and political scientist Daniel Dewdney. On Ideas, here's Ron Deibert with the third of the 2020 CBC Massey Lectures.
This is Lecture 3, Toxic Addiction Machines. Part 1, The COVID Conspiracy. In late 2019 and early 2020, as I was preparing these talks, the deadly COVID-19 virus broke out in Wuhan, China, and began to quickly spread around the world. Governments, NGOs, international health organizations, health officials, and others rushed to inform and prepare populations and contain the spread of the contamination. In 2020, one might be excused for thinking that the light-speed communication channels we have established across the planet, which we rely on for news and information, would greatly assist in the swift dissemination of accurate information and safety precautions. Think again. In what has become commonplace around any major news event, the circulation of information about the coronavirus on social media was flooded with conspiracy theories, misinformation, deliberately propagated false information, known as disinformation, racist memes, chat censorship and surveillance, and even viruses of another kind. Official news, alerts, and health tips from groups like the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention or the World Health Organization competed with tweets and Facebook posts from conspiracy theory accounts that said, among other things, that drinking bleach could cure the virus. I wouldn't recommend that, but tens of thousands of those who reposted it did. The WHO went so far as to label COVID-19 an infodemic, explaining that the outbreak and response has been accompanied by an overabundance of information, some accurate and some not, that makes it hard for people to find trustworthy sources and reliable guidance when they need it. Even a colleague of mine whose judgment I trust sent me an email from the news website CCN. Yes, that's CCN, not CNN, claiming that the virus was the result of an accidental release of a secret Chinese military biological weapons test. Meanwhile, Russian propaganda outlets spread disinformation across social media that the virus is actually a US-made bioweapon deliberately designed to target China. Alarmingly, disinformation spread through social media contributed directly to mob violence and armed clashes with police in Ukraine. An email designed to appear as though it was from an official Ukrainian health agency claim that cases of the infection had begun to spread wildly in the country. The information was false, and the email was a forgery. Yet that did nothing to stop a significant number of Ukrainians from believing it and circulating it widely through social media. A large, angry group of protesters gathered at an airport to confront a plane chartered to evacuate Ukrainians from China. The mob smashed the windows of buses carrying the evacuees, torched police barricades, and clashed violently with police. The entire melee, broken glass, fistfights, arrests and all, was the result of what was, in essence, a doctored meme. Social media companies responded to the infodemic in typically mixed and slightly confused fashion. At first, Facebook announced that it would remove posts containing misinformation about the virus, while YouTube, Twitter, and Reddit claimed that inaccurate information about health was not a violation of their terms of service policies, leaving the algorithms to propel content that grabs attention, stokes fear, and fuels conspiracy theorizing. After sending human content moderators into self-isolation, Facebook turned to artificial intelligence tools instead, with unfortunate results. The machine-based moderation system swept through, but mistakenly removed links to even official government-related health information. Gradually, each of the platforms introduced measures to point users to credible health information, flag unverified information, and remove disinformation, but in uncoordinated fashion and with questionable results. The platform's intrinsic bias towards the speed and volume of posts made the measures inherently ineffective, allowing swarms of false information to circulate unimpeded. The sorry state of miscommunication and information chaos around COVID-19 is not the first instance in which a major public health crisis has been exacerbated by social media. When the deadly Zika virus broke out in Brazil in 2015, health workers told reporters they felt overwhelmed by the false content deliberately seeded through social media channels. Propelled forward by algorithms that select content for their sensational content, Brazilians searching YouTube for accurate health information received instead disturbing claims that the virus was being spread by vaccinations and by insecticides meant to curb mosquito populations. The poorest communities, where literacy is low, time to fact-check is scarce, and access to more detailed content is constrained by mobile media, were most affected by the spread of inaccurate and inauthentic news, and were among those the disease hit the hardest. A pediatric neurologist, hoping to stem the Zika tide, expressed his frustration. "Fake news is a virtual war. We have it coming from every direction," he said.
Hi, Tamsin Shaw here. I think Ron's absolutely right that fake news is being used in a war by the far right. What is distinctive about liberal democratic forms of government is that they require us to hold governments accountable. That doesn't mean that politicians need to know an awful lot about us. It means that we need to know an awful lot about them, about what their policies are, about how they would implement them, about the likely consequences of those. We can't hold them accountable in an information environment that erodes that kind of knowledge. So the right, insofar as it is attacking that knowledge and undermining it by polluting it all with fake news, is actually undermining our capacity to hold political actors accountable. And that can alter political life very radically. So we're no longer then living in a framework where we have the right competing with the left within a liberal democracy, but rather the right is setting out to destroy liberal democratic accountability and destroy liberal democracy. And that can only really go in one direction, which is authoritarianism.
Part 2. The Global Problem. We live in a single global village with numerous shared problems crying out for collective action, from immediate emergencies like COVID-19 to longer-term existential challenges such as global climate change and nuclear weapons. What harbinger is it for the future when one of the principal means we have to communicate with each other is so heavily distorted in ways that propel confusion and chaos? What hope do we have to ever manage our collective future when our global public sphere has become such a poisonous brew of xenophobia, ignorance, and malice? One might reasonably ask, how is it that, with such awe-inspiring computer power and telecommunications resources at our disposal, we have arrived in such a dismal condition? Even though a growing number of people are alarmed by social media, recognize the ill effects, and lambaste the various platforms as cesspools of hatred, racism, intimidation, and ignorance, the fact of the matter is, we still rely on them. Indeed, many of us even like them. To understand the roots of this apparent contradiction requires us to take a step back and examine not only our uses of social media, but the way social media in turn use us and what their engineering of us implies for the global public sphere. Oxford Bibliographies defines the public sphere as, quote, the social space in which different opinions are expressed, problems of general concern are discussed, and collective solutions are developed communicatively. According to the German political theorist Jürgen Habermas, arguably the topic's best-known thinker, the public sphere is intimately connected to the material circumstances of time and place. For example, Habermas argues the combination of European coffee houses and salons, a high degree of relative literacy, and a print-based vernacular media environment led to the flourishing of the bourgeois public sphere of the Enlightenment period. We are living in the midst of a fundamental reordering of our communications environment, one that is unprecedented in its scope and scale. While there are some positive aspects of social media, there are also numerous negative byproducts and externalities that seem to be spreading unhindered. To be sure, there has never been a particular place or time in history when we could say the media were decidedly unprejudiced or not biased in some manner. There's a reason Habermas referred to his conditions for the public sphere as ideal. But almost everyone now senses a serious erosion in the quality of discourse online, a deterioration in the quality of our admittedly already flawed domain of public conversations, a complete inversion of the conditions that gave rise to Habermas's coffee houses. And yet, in spite of it all, this deterioration only accelerates, deepens, and expands as social media's popularity advances. How to explain it? The answer lies in a series of linked causal relationships inherent to our communications ecosystem and emanating out of the dynamics of surveillance capitalism. At the lowest level is the most basic business imperative of the personal data surveillance economy, capturing and retaining customers' attention. Social media companies need users, and they want the users to stay connected to their services as long as possible. To accomplish that objective, social media engineers use techniques from advertising and behavioral science to make the uses of social media more compelling and more difficult to ignore. Human nature being what it is, our attention tends to be captured by sensational, extreme, scandalous, and even horrifying content that shocks us or pulls on our emotions. The systematic preference given to emotionally charged content, combined with the sheer volume of data, makes it increasingly difficult, or at least more time-consuming, for the average person to discern fact from falsehood. The personalization of social media especially content targeted at individuals and small groups of people with shared interests, helps to divide mass audiences into specialized segments, which in turn reinforces social polarization. And it is here where opportunity knocks. A communications ecosystem that propels sensational, extreme, and polarizing content by design is a perfect fit for those actors who aim to foment chaos and cynicism. Looking at it this way, it's clear how deeply embedded are the multiple causal mechanisms that together produce the surface phenomena we experience with social media on a daily basis. This outcome is not an accident or a minor byproduct. It is a predictable behavioral outcome of the material properties of the communications environment in which we live. It also makes evident how solving the malign characteristics we associate with social media is not going to be simple. It won't be something that we can fix by a single policy, let alone a newfangled app. What we are experiencing collectively is a function of a linked set of deeply entrenched and mutually supportive social forces. Untangling these will be exceedingly difficult.
This is Daniel Dudney. Ron makes a lot of really powerful, critical perspectives here on what's really going on with the internet, social media at its core, and the central importance of the emotions, the manipulation of people, of sensations, of emotions. Look, the reality is that this is a novel possibility at this kind of scale, but the basic move of manipulating people emotionally has been at the center of demagoguery and the dark arts of politics from the beginning. Another way of thinking about what's happening here, I like this quote from E.O. Wilson, the biologist, that humans have Pleistocene emotions, medieval government, and godlike technology. And what can go wrong, right? That there's this lag. So there's going to have to be some really important parsing here. We're going to have to establish constraints on the types of imagery that can be used in these systems. Or alternatively, we're going to have to somehow socialize people, educate people into a greater critical capacity. That we've got to make, critical consumers, critical participants. Insofar as we talk about, the digital citizenry and so forth, this kind of language has been used a lot. Citizens is definitely not what we have now. We've got to solve that problem, really, of a civilization of our species, and certainly of liberal democracies.
This is Meredith Whitaker again. I appreciate this passage, the way these systems that claim to capture our reality are actually shaping our reality and our understanding of the world. One of the framings I hesitate around is the idea that we are sort of naturally drawn to this content. And that's not because I don't think there are ways in which people can appeal to sort of deep urges within each one of us, but because I think it kind of naturalizes the rise of extremism that we are seeing now, which is linked to these sort of radicalizing content that is often sort of disseminated through these platforms. And again, I think we have to go back to recognize that there is a commercial incentive on the part of these companies to sort of display content that is catchy, sure, but there is also an organized effort to disseminate this content. This doesn't happen naturally. It's not simply that our lizard brains gravitate toward fascist or extremist content. It is that there are people who are well-funded and organized who are backing the dissemination of this content. Our taste for those things is not something that is naturalized in humans.
Part 3, Addiction Machines. In 2018, a new term circulated widely, techlash. Not only a growing irritation with social media's ill effects, but a major pushback against the entire roster of technology platforms. Let's face it, people are fed up with social media. Just about everyone has some kind of complaint, not just about the applications or the platforms, but also about the billionaire executives that run it all. People like Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg or Twitter's Jack Dorsey. I don't know how many times I've heard friends and family members complain, Twitter is a dumpster fire, or I can't stand Facebook, Zuckerberg is creepy. And yet, everywhere I look, I see the same people still glued to their devices. The popularity of social media continues to grow unabated in spite of spreading knowledge of the platform's many problems. To be sure, there are ups and downs. One social media platform is superseded by another. MySpace is replaced by Facebook. Facebook will undoubtedly be eventually overtaken by something else. But the economic system as a whole upon which they are all based, the personal data surveillance economy, continuously expands. But is this popularity entirely witting? Here, the answer gets a bit more complex. There is the issue of whether users fully understand the choices they are making when they sign on to social media. Most have by now become accustomed to downloading and installing numerous applications, each of which comes with lengthy terms of service that most users do not read, let alone understand. One computer software diagnostic company did an experiment to prove the point. It put an offer to give away $100 at the very end of its terms of service to see how many would read that far. 4 months and 3,000 downloads later, one user finally did. Add to the mix the boilerplate contract language used in terms of service, which most laypeople are poorly equipped to understand, and the veil of ignorance around contractual obligations becomes thicker. Social media are addictive because they stimulate us in a powerfully subconscious and hormonal way. Social media affect brains like falling in love. Your level of oxytocin, otherwise known as the love hormone for the feelings it generates, rises as much as 13% when you use social media for as little as 10 minutes. Studies are now convincingly showing that people addicted to social media experience symptoms similar to those experienced by individuals who suffer from addictions to substances or other behaviors, such as withdrawal, relapse, and mood modification. One research project showed that the mere presence of a switched-off smartphone significantly decreases a person's ability to focus on a task. Environmental stimuli, such as people, places, or routines, can stimulate and help reinforce the addictive behavior, which might explain why many of us habitually pull out our phones every time we're waiting in a grocery line or using public transport. Is it accurate to describe our embrace of social media as willful and voluntary when that embrace has the properties of an addiction? In fact, the companies are not only aware of the addictive and emotionally compelling characteristics of social media, they study and refine them intensively and with extraordinary resources. In order to be effective, company executives understand social media must generate a kind of consumer compulsion. To encourage continued engagement with their platforms, social media companies borrow basic psychological methods reaching back to American psychologist B.F. Skinner, such as operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is based on altering behavior using a system of rewards and punishments. Behavior that is followed by pleasant consequences or anticipation of future rewards is likely to be repeated. Behavior that is followed by negative consequences is likely to be avoided. The former president of Facebook, Sean Parker, recently made remarkable admissions about how Facebook employs such methods to hook people on its platform. Parker described how features such as like buttons were designed to give users a little dopamine hit. He went on to explain, quote, "It's a social validation feedback loop, exactly the kind of thing that a hacker like myself would come up with because you're exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology." Concluded Parker ominously, "Our choices are not as free as we think they are." As with other products where addiction is a factor, tobacco, casinos, the behavioral modification parts of the story are only dimly understood by consumers, but studied intensively by the people who run the platforms and by the social media analytics companies, marketing firms, and PR consultants that orbit around them. As New York University professor Tamsin Shaw put it, quote, "The findings of social psychology and behavioral economics are being employed to determine the news we read, the products we buy, the cultural and intellectual spheres we inhabit, and the human networks, online and in real life, of which we are a part. Indeed, psychological experiments on consumers are essential to refining just about all of social media and related digital applications." A disturbing example is an experiment Facebook undertook in 2010, just before the U.S. midterm elections that year. Facebook researchers placed an "I voted" button at the top of the user's news feeds, along with the location of polling stations and details on whether their friends had clicked the button. Facebook researchers then checked public voting records to determine which users actually voted, and found they were more likely to click the "I voted" button if they noticed their friends had done so as well. In other words, Facebook discovered it could subtly encourage people to vote. Although that experiment may seem banal, perhaps even socially beneficial, it's but a short step from, quote, "encouraging people to vote" to, quote, "encouraging people to vote for this party and not that one." With such capabilities in hand back in 2010, imagine what could be done now, or a few short years from now. While social media's engineers develop their platforms in subtle ways to grab and keep our attention, they also aim to make their products as unintrusive as possible. The goal of the developers is to have social media recede into the background, to wash from our minds the fact that they are indeed always there, lurking, probing, and shaping.
It's Misha Glenny here. I think for the moment, most of us wrestle every day with the addictive qualities of social media. The only social media that I use regularly is Twitter. But I notice that I waste endless amounts of time scrolling through Twitter. And what's fascinating about it is that although I'm surfing across a very, very broad area of information, I don't actually engage with anything on a deep level. It's just those quick dopamine hits which appear to be so exciting to human physiology. And I really find it difficult to put the damn thing down. So although they may aim to be sort of in the background all the time so we don't know that we're using them, I think many of us sense instinctively that there is something deeply, deeply not just destructive, but they're dumbing us down. They make us actually feel more stupid and not more empowered. And I think the only way to combat all of this is some sort of regulatory system.
Hello, this is Chinmay Arun. We have been in this state of arguably crisis for many years now, and it has been exacerbated as technology becomes capable of more. We have been in this state in which we have been subject to social media, both in terms of data gathering and what people like to call manipulation for many years. And it's only now that we're beginning to come to terms with what it is and with the ways in which it can harm us. It harms us also as a society, it affects the people around us. And so even if we should choose to opt out, there are other people that are very much a part of this system among whom we live. And so opting out is not an option. That's a part of it. The other is that because it is designed to be engaging, addictive, and because so much effort has been made into integrating much of our activity with it. If you go to university, if you hold a job, if you are an independent professional that needs to engage with other people in your network, all of that forces you back on the social media, whether you'd like to be there or not. And so in that sense, we often don't really have a choice about whether we want to engage or not. So it is a dangerous world in which we're living, both in terms of the ways in which it impacts us and the ways in which the problem is being dealt with, which is not at all.
You're listening to the third of the 2020 CBC Massey Lectures, Toxic Addiction Machines by Ron Deibert. This is Ideas, in Canada on CBC Radio 1, on Sirius XM across North America, in Australia on RN, and around the world at cbc.ca/ideas. I'm Nala Ayed. It's looking as if the internet and social media have been taken over by extremists and bad actors. We've all been turned into addicts. Our personal data is being stolen and sold to the highest bidder. We're spied on and surveilled by foreign powers, and the phones and tablets we're all using are polluting the planet. So how do we get back control? On today's program, Ron Deibert looks at the interplay between social media and social psychology. The latest insights and methods from commercial advertising and behavioral psychology are being used against us to turn us into addicts for clicks and likes, leading to ever more extreme and sensational content. This is Toxic Addiction Machines, the third of the 2020 CBC Massey Lectures. Here's Ron Deibert.
Part 4, the Corporate Government Complex. Any particular ecosystem can become a breeding ground for parasites or other invasive species, and so it is with our existing social media ecosystem. An environment already biased towards content that is sensationalistic, emotional, and divisive is perfectly suited to those who wish to bend the rules to their advantage. Just as mosquitoes breed in a warm, humid climate with lots of standing water, those who seek to foment chaos, mistrust, and fear as smokescreens for their corrupt aims are flourishing in our communications environment. There are few rules in the targeted advertisement industry, but even those who are more inclined to play by the rules feel the pressure to get on board or be left behind when it comes to capitalizing on the effects of social media. As a consequence, we are seeing an explosion of social media-enabled PR, disinformation, psyops, and influence operations, some open, commercial, and seemingly above board, but many others inhabiting a subterranean underworld of illicit acts, dark money, and state subterfuge. Propaganda, mass advertising, psychological operations, terms and concepts, all linked to manipulating people's thoughts and thus behaviors, have a long history that goes back to ancient times. In the early years of the 20th century, the twin engines of commercial advertising and military propaganda took off simultaneously, and not coincidentally. Edward Bernays, widely considered the father of modern public relations, drew from the theories of his uncle Sigmund Freud to tap into subconscious, erotic, and emotional human traits and push cigarettes to women, among other products. In the 1940s, the United Fruit Company hired Bernays, who later used his public relations expertise to help foment a coup in Guatemala after the election of a president who was unfavorable to the company. Bernays helped mount a multi-pronged disinformation campaign designed to discredit the democratically elected president Jacobo Arbenz as a communist puppet and motivate U.S. lawmakers and thought leaders to support an overthrow. Eventually, the CIA did just that, launching a covert coup d'etat, codenamed Operation PB Success, which replaced Arbenz with the military dictatorship of Carlos Castillo Armas. Bernays' Freudian-inspired techniques of thought persuasion not only inspired the coup, they became instruments in the arsenal of the CIA. To think that covert ops such as these are the dark arts of a distant time is naive in the extreme. While the early pioneers may be gone, the precedents they set and the techniques and tradecraft they innovated have all now been passed down to social media-enabled descendants superpowered with computing resources, finances, and seemingly endless pools of behavioral data from which to draw. Psychological operations have become a highly profitable market, and so a huge industry is sprouting up to serve the interests of dozens of autocrats, despots, and unethical business executives. Not surprisingly, those inclined to authoritarianism around the world are actively taking advantage of the already propitious environment that social media presents for them and their strategic interests. A recent survey by the Oxford Internet Institute found that 48 countries have at least one government agency or political party engaged in shaping public opinion through social media. Authoritarian-minded leaders like Donald Trump, Russia's Vladimir Putin, Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Philippines' Rodrigo Duterte, and numerous others lambaste fake news while simultaneously pushing, often shamelessly, blatant falsehoods. Supporting their efforts are a growing number of black and gray companies, ranging from sketchy startups to massive consulting ventures, all of which stand to make millions engineering consent, undermining adversaries, or simply seeding dissent. We are, as a consequence, witnessing a dangerous blending of the ancient arts of propaganda, advertising, and psychological operations with the machinery and power of artificial intelligence and big data. These efforts have helped transform the nature and character of information control among authoritarian regimes. In the early days of the Internet, authoritarian governments tried to prevent their citizens from accessing undesirable content, many using Western-made surveillance and censorship technologies. Now, thanks to social media, an environment of information abundance, and the opportunities of disinformation, these regimes are following a strategy that author and journalist Peter Pomerantsev, in his book This Is Not Propaganda, calls, quote, censorship through noise. If you can't beat them, join in and flood them. Governments are not the only ones exploiting the opportunities of social media to experiment in psyops. It should come as no surprise that big corporations are getting into the game too. Perhaps the most alarming are the well-funded corporate disinformation campaigns around climate change, which have roots going back decades, but are now multiplying in the chaos of the communications ecosystem. Big oil, chemical, and other extractive industry companies have hired private investigators to dig up dirt on lawyers, investigative journalists, and advocacy organizations. They've employed hackers for hire to target NGOs and their funders and leak the details of their strategic planning to shady media outlets on corporate payrolls. They have built entire organizations, think tanks, and other front organizations to generate scientific-looking but implausible reports that are then seeded into disinformation campaigns and targeted advertisements meant to disorient and distract audiences from the real science of climate change. The consequences for global public safety are disturbing, to say the least. As one author presciently put it, manufactured doubt is everywhere, defending dangerous products in the food we eat, the beverages we drink, and the air we breathe. The direct impact is thousands of people needlessly sickened. As my Citizen Lab colleague John Scott Railton put it, the social media space has become a giant disinformation laboratory for sketchy PR firms and their unethical and corrupt clients.
So this is Astra. I mean, I always think when we talk about disinformation, sensationalism, I always think back to Plato and the Republic, just as a reminder to us that the problems of people believing untruths is ancient. It precedes social media. And so, this is part of, I think, the human temperament. We like gossip, we like hyperbole. And so what you want to do is build a communications infrastructure that doesn't fuel that, that perhaps mitigates it and brings out our better angels. Well, that is not what social media does. What it does is it latches on to these tendencies and commoditizes them and has built a business model around them. So, I think the problem with these platforms that we use is many of them are advertiser driven. That's the funding model. Well, none of us think that advertising is truth. Advertising is hype. So you have these incredibly important platforms that are built, like by design, they're there to serve a kind of disinformation. I mean, that's what ads are. Ads are not journalism. Ads are not educational lessons, right? Ads are not facts. We know this. So we've built this problem in. We've baked this problem into the platforms that we're all dependent on by depending on the advertiser dollar. I like to think of our new media age as one in which actually, instead of focusing on the manufacture of consent, is about the manufacture of compulsion. What our new digital media overlords want us to do is click. And they don't really care what we click on. They just want us to do it compulsively over and over and over again. One might also say that they're interested in the manufacture of confusion. The more confused we are, the more we compulsively click. And that's why I think it's so important that we break out of this advertiser-driven business model and we start really investing in content that is more substantive and requires a deeper kind of attention and focus, because this is a very socially destructive framework that we're in right now.
It's John Norton here. If you want to understand, for example, Facebook, and many people now do, then you don't go into it as a user. You go into it as an advertiser, because anybody can do it. And when you do that, you encounter a truly amazing software machine. It's a machine that guides you towards identifying the kinds of people who might be receptive to whatever kind of advertisement you wish to place. And I've done it, and it's utterly awe-inspiring in its automated ingenuity. It's a truly beautiful machine, wonderfully designed and implemented. But the thing that always really strikes me is how come that the geniuses who designed this machine for enabling advertisers to direct ads at people who be receptive to them so they might buy whatever it is you're trying to sell, how come that they never thought that it would be just as good for bad actors to direct messages to people who might be receptive to them? And those bad actors don't just include unscrupulous domestic ones, but foreign powers and other agencies who had nothing to sell but ideas and conspiracy theories and racism and white supremacism and other crap.
Part 5, Disinformation. An always-on, real-time information tsunami creates the perfect environment for the spread of false narratives, conspiracy theories, and leaks. Hardwired cognitive biases and mental shortcuts are primed to push them along. Individual users may not have the expertise, tools, or time to verify claims. By the time any of them do, the falsehoods may have already embedded themselves in the collective consciousness. Meanwhile, fresh scandals and outlandish claims are continuously raining down on users, confusing fact and fiction. Worse yet, studies have found that attempts, quote, to quash rumors through direct refutation may facilitate their diffusion by increasing fluency. In other words, efforts to correct falsehoods can ironically contribute to their further propagation and even acceptance. The constant bombardment of tainted leaks, conspiracy theories, and other misinformation in turn fuels cynicism about the media and all institutions. Citizens become fatigued trying to discern objective truth as the flood of news washes over them hour by hour. Questioning the integrity of all media can in turn lead to fatalism, cynicism, and eventually paralysis. In the words of social media expert Ethan Zuckerman, quote, "A plurality of unreality does not persuade the listener of one set of facts or another, but encourages the listener to doubt everything." Contributing to this problem are the actions, or inactions, of social media companies themselves, who appear either unwilling or unable to weed out malicious or false information. That's not to say the companies are sitting idle. They are feeling the pressure to react and have taken several noteworthy steps to combat the plague of disinformation, including shutting down inauthentic accounts by the thousands, hiring more personnel to screen posts and investigate malpractice on their platforms, downranking clearly false information on users' feeds, and collaborating with fact-checking and other research organizations to spot disinformation. These efforts intensified during the COVID pandemic. But in spite of these measures, social media remain polluted by misinformation and disinformation, not only because of their own internal mechanisms, which privilege sensational content, or because of the speed and volume of posts, but also thanks to the actions of malicious actors who seek to game them. For example, in spite of widespread revelations of Russian influence operations over social media in 2016, 2 years later, researchers posing as Russian trolls were still able to buy political ads on Google, even paying in Russian currency, registering from a Russian zip code, and using indicators linking their advertisements to the Internet Research Agency, the very trolling farm that was the subject of intense congressional scrutiny and indictments by Robert Mueller. In similar fashion, despite all of the attention given and promises made to control misinformation about COVID-19 on its platform, an April 2020 study by The Markup found Facebook was nonetheless still allowing advertisers to target users who the company believes are interested in pseudoscience, a category of roughly 78 million people. In testimony before U.S. Congress, Facebook CEO Sheryl Sandberg made a startling admission that from October 2017 to March 2018, Facebook deleted 1.3 billion fake accounts. In July 2018, Twitter was deleting on the order of 1 million accounts a day and had deleted 70 million fake Twitter accounts between May and June 2018 alone. The revelations caused Twitter's share price to drop by 8%, a good indication of the type of business disincentives working against digging too deep into one's own platform in the search for fake accounts. Put simply, removing accounts and cleaning up your platform is also bad for business. Social media's inability to track inauthentic behavior seems destined to get far worse before it gets better, as malicious actors are now using altered images and videos called deep fakes, as well as large WhatsApp groups to spread disinformation virally. These techniques are far more difficult for the platforms to combat, and will almost certainly become a staple of discrediting and blackmail campaigns in the political realm. But for all the deletions, fact-checking, and monitoring systems they produce, social media will remain easy to exploit as a tool of disinformation as long as gathering subscribers is at the heart of the business model. Information and communications technologies have perennially held out hope for more reasoned deliberation and a more informed citizenry, but rarely rise to the occasion. Elites have for centuries deliberately spread false information to serve their narrow political aims, and have used whatever communications technologies were at their disposal to do so. However, social media are uniquely architected in such a way that these types of practices can easily flourish and thrive. Thanks to their attention-seeking algorithms, social media platforms propel sensational and extreme content by design. Using methods that are refined to tap into deep-seated cognitive traits, social media feed on our emotions, biases, and other mental shortcuts, creating roadblocks to effective reasoning and rational public discourse. The overall environment turns out to be one that can easily be gamed by those whose aims are to foster social divisions and public chaos, now a dark money-making venture of its own. It's clear who stands to benefit by this environment. Despots who fear scrutiny and public accountability, and who gain when citizens grow complacent with exhaustion, trying to separate fact from fiction. Here we see the power of unintended consequences in technological development perfectly illustrated. A vehicle designed to capture and retain people's attention while serving up a socially useful and entertaining platform has turned out to be a cesspool in which authoritarian practices can prosper unhindered.
You've been listening to Toxic Addiction Machines, the third of the 2020 CBC Massey Lectures by Ron Deibert. The entire lecture series will be on our website, cbc.ca/Masseys, and you can also download the podcasts from our podcast page. Your local or online bookseller will have the book of the lectures, Reset, Reclaiming the Internet for Civil Society, published by House of Anansi Press. And now that you've been listening to the lectures, we're inviting you to send us the questions you have for Ron Deibert. We'll be creating a special program to run with the rebroadcast of the series in March 2021. I'll be talking with Ron along with the guests you heard on the program, and we'll be discussing some of the questions you send us. So send your questions to masseyquestions@cbc.ca. That's masseyquestions@cbc.ca. Our partners in the Massey Lecture series are Massey College in the University of Toronto and House of Anansi Press. The Massey Lectures series is produced by Philip Coulter. Online production by Althea Madison, Andrew Nguyen, and Sinisha Jolich. Our web producer is Lisa Ayuso. Technical production, Danielle Duval. Senior producer, Nicola Luksic. The executive producer of the Massey Lectures and Ideas is Greg Kelly, and I'm Nala Ayed.